Chapter 6. Technoblade, it turns out, has a bit of an affinity for animals. Or maybe it's just Phil's crow. The first time the bird fluttered up onto Technoblade's shoulder instead of Phil's, the pirate had sputtered in feigned indignance, though he couldn't keep the grin off his face. "Oh, Brian, you little shit." He waggles a finger in the bird's face, who nips playfully back and ruffles its wings. "Playing favorites already, are we?" And he shoots an accusing look at Technoblade, who can't keep the grin off his own face as the bird nuzzles closer into his neck with a happy croak. "What can I say?" Technoblade drawls, lifting a finger to scratch at the soft feathers atop the crow's head. "Animals just like me." After that, the bird sticks a lot closer to Technoblade, as if to spite Phil. The look on Phil's face when Brian gives him the cold shoulder, only to cuddle up next to Technoblade instead, never fails to make Technoblade laugh, if only to add insult to injury. It's all in good fun, though a part of Technoblade does enjoy the bird's company. It's nice to have a companion when his work gets dull or things get too quiet. Brian is always quick to answer him with a throaty caw or a softer croon when he voices his thoughts aloud, and it's easy to pretend he's having an actual conversation with the bird. It's better than admitting how silly he must look. He was genuine when he told Phil about his tendency to bond with animals. He'd made quick friends of the dock's mousers back when he worked at the port, and a quicker friend yet of the ship's own feline companion. The little calico kitten, Crumb, Ronbu had called her, named after she'd been found covered in her namesake in the pantry of his old estate, is fierce and cuddly all at once, and though her bite packs a punch, she's swift to sweeten up to Technoblade when he offers her some dried fish. So, yeah, he's pretty good with animals. He usually prefers their company anyway. Phil is far too noisy. His hidden talent comes in handy sooner than he expected. They've dropped anchor not far from the shore of a small island. The crew is taking advantage of the brief reprieve to splash and swim in the clear blue waters around the ship. Technoblade still isn't much of a swimmer. He hasn't so much as set foot in the ocean since that night so many months ago. He stands and leans against the railing, watching as the crew's younger members tumble around in the waters. Tubbo and Tommy are taking turns dunking one another, squawking and shrieking playfully. Somewhere beneath the glittering surface, he can see the flash of black and white scales, and every once in a while the boys are tugged under from below. Ronbu's perplexing form had been accepted into the crew with surprising ease, after the revelation during battle. Tommy and Tubbo seemed to have known beforehand, much to his chagrin, because they scarcely so much as flinched when Ronbu first transformed again after the incident. It doesn't surprise him. The three are practically inseparable. It only makes sense that they'd have known Ronbu's secret from the very beginning. He has his own suspicions that said secret might be the very reason Ronbu fled his family in the first place. There's a shadowed look in the kid's eyes when he speaks of his parents, no matter how fond the stories seem, and Tubbo seems to tense whenever the subject of him returning is brought up in conversation. But it's not his place to share, and if the kid does tell his story, it'll be when he's ready to, and only then. Regardless, the kid is enjoying himself, and that's good enough for now. They all deserve a break, particularly after that last fight. Phil most of all, not that he'll take one. His injury is healing well, despite his best efforts to keep reopening it with his constant antics. Eric's tongue lashing in the wake of his new stitches had subdued the pirate enough to keep him from scaling the crow's nest too frequently, although Technoblade still catches him up there now and then. The stitches have been removed, leaving behind only an angry red scar, and the sight of it still makes Technoblade's stomach twist. A few inches difference, and it could have been Phil's heart instead of his shoulder. It could have been Ronbu. Phil's quick thinking saved the kid from a bad hit, a potentially fatal one at that. He's got no clue why the men were firing at the very person they were supposed to bring back in one piece, or how Phil managed to get to Ronbu's side fast enough. but he wouldn't sully his gratitude with pointless wonderings. He doesn't want to lose a kid on his watch. And neither does Phil. The man is watching over the crew as they swim, just as Technoblade is. He leans casually next to him, looking for all the world like the perfect picture of indifference, were it not for the way his eyes continue to dart toward the children as they splash around. He's whistling a merry tune under his breath, leaning into the wind as he always does, but Technoblade can see the way his muscles are coiled beneath the surface, ready to spring at a moment's notice. That's something else he's begun to notice about Phil, now that he can read him better. Phil is always on guard, always on edge, even when he seems reckless and carefree. When he says he's keeping an eye out in the crow's nest, he truly is, nearly every moment dedicated to scanning the horizon. Phil seems to be prepared for every bad situation, and Technoblade is loath to think what could have caused the man to live in such a way. Beneath his shining smile, there's a tension that doesn't seem to go away. A suspicion in the way he glances behind him when his back is turned to the crew. He remembers how he found Phil, cuffed to the wall and abandoned by his crew for the Navy to collect, and thinks that perhaps his suspicions aren't unfounded. Still, he wishes he could pry a more genuine smile out of the man now and then. He's annoyingly persistent in his stubborn attempts to tease and bother Technoblade with awful jokes and relentless banter, but the smile never fully carries over to his eyes, save for when he's up in the crow's nest, and the weight of the world seems to trade itself for a pair of wings. An awful squawk jolts him out of his thoughts. Beside him, Phil makes a soft sound of surprise, and Technoblade follows his wide-eyed gaze to the rigging. At first, he thinks it must have been Brian. The crow is nothing if not persistent in his harassment of various crew members. But when he looks up to the ropes, he sees white feathers instead of black, struggling violently where they're tangled amidst the gaps. The hell? Phil voices his thoughts. Is that? A bird, Technoblade affirms. Must be from that island. But what's it doing this far out? Questions later, mate. I think the poor thing's stuck. And so it is. Tufts of down flutter from the sky above, panicked noises filling the air, and Technoblade is scaling the rigging before he can even think about his panic from the weeks prior. He reaches the bird and reaches out a hand to steady it, but the creature is having none of it, its struggles renewing with fresh vigor and fear. Hold still, he says softly. I'm not going to hurt you. It's all right. Shh, everything's all right. His hand stills in soft white feathers. The bird seems to still as well, as if sensing no malice from him. That's it. I'm just here to help you, that's all. His voice drops to a soft murmur as he works at untangling the fragile wing from the coarse ropes. How the heck did you manage this, huh? Silly thing. The bird makes a softer noise at that, only to shriek in pain when the wing finally comes free from its confines. It clings frantically to the ropes, the wing draping limply beside it, and it's clear the poor creature is hurt. And so he gathers the bird close to his chest with a sympathetic noise and begins the arduous task of climbing back down with only one hand. His landing is less than graceful, but Phil is there to steady him when he stumbles. Aw, mate. Phil coos down at the frazzled bird. Poor guy's wing must be broken. Looks like it. Technoblade grunts, holding the bird gingerly, absently trailing his fingers through the puffed-up feathers atop its head in an attempt to soothe it. It must have tried to land on the ropes and gotten caught in them. Phil smiles sympathetically. Let's get him all bandaged up then, huh? Phil is surprisingly gentle, Technoblade discovers. Though his hands are rough and worn from years out at sea, they are anything but clumsy as he carefully winds pristine white bandages around the bird's injured wing, setting the splint with a few old scraps of wood for good measure. He talks Technoblade through the whole process, his voice low and soothing, so as not to disturb their patient, who has somehow managed to fall into a slumber, though from exhaustion or pain, he can't tell. You'll want to remove the bandages every now and then and help him stretch his wing out. Phil instructs. I will? I already have a bird. And Brian gets quite jealous. Phil quips with a grin. Besides, aren't you the one who said animals just like you? How could we just waste such a talent? His tone is teasing, but Technoblade can't find it in himself to rise to the bait, nor can he suppress the little flicker of fondness he feels when he looks down at the slumbering bird on his lap. Guess you're right, he grumbles, and can't help but smile himself. You gonna give him a name, mate? Phil suddenly inquires, leaning forward with an eager smile. Technoblade blinks. He starts, and grapples for something, anything at all. Floof? Phil's laughter fills the room as Technoblade's cheeks burn. Wait, No, changing it. Phil, hang on. Nah, mate, this is too good to pass up. Phil wheezes. Pirate Captain Technoblade and his fearsome pet parrot Floof. It's better than Brian. Is it? Is it, mate? Floof it is. Floof and Brian turn out to be thick as thieves. They're just as bad as Tommy and Tubbo, a plague of mischief upon the crew when Floof starts to fly again. And if Technoblade catches Nicky giving him and Phil a knowing look one night, as they watch their birds playfully squabble over a scrap of dried meat, he pays her no heed, even if he can see the similarities too. The peace, like all good things, doesn't last. They're still a good many leagues from port when it happens. It starts with an eerie noise, halfway between a song and a wail. It rises from a shoal not 30 meters from the boat, stretching on and on before falling silent. It sounds beautiful. It sounds like death. Sirens, Phil whispers from beside him, his eyes wide and his lips half parted. Sirens? Technoblade echoes, as a chill shoots down his spine. I thought they were a myth, an old wives' tale. Gods, no. Phil replies, and his face has gone ghostly pale. They're real, mate. Very real and very deadly. We shouldn't be here. Our course shouldn't have taken us this close. And then he's moving, surging across the deck like thunder, shouting frantic orders to those that will listen. Sirens! Cover your ears! He cries, and there's no distinguishing the panic in his tone. The crew is quick to comply at the sudden seriousness of their first mate. With your hands, with your shirts, with your coats. Tie yourself to the ship if you must. He's a blur of motion, his feet more like wings as he surges below deck, presumably to warn any unsuspecting crew members. The ship is in disarray as the crew moves to protect themselves, and Technoblade urges the members they can spare below deck, where they'll be further from the dangerous song. There's no time to waste. The song only grows louder with every second that goes by, even as he and Nicky move to steer the ship away from the haunting cries. The sound, muffled as it is through Technoblade's hands, leaves his brain in a state of static, and he finds himself moving in a daze, almost as if sleepwalking. Thankfully, he has enough control to ground himself to the wheel alongside Nicky, and together they guide the Argo away from the shoal while their crew cling desperately to the railings and rigging to resist the deadly urge. He can see fins, almost shark-like save for their unusually bright colors, cutting through the water around the rocks. The song seems to grow almost angry as their ship turns away from it, rising to a piercing shriek that makes Technoblade's head ache and his teeth grit. And then, finally, it's over. Everyone all right? Technoblade asks, once the wailing has faded to a distant cry on the wind. There are a series of murmured affirmations, some of the crew looking rather dazed, but no worse for wear. Good. Good work, Phil. That was quick thinking. That could have been bad. Really bad. Silence answers him. Phil? Nothing. The crew seems to wake up at that. Technoblade's heart begins to beat with a new ferocity as he searches the crowd for the face of his friend, and comes up short one first mate. He can hear them echoing Phil's name, the urgency rising until murmurs grow to shouts, and frantic feet pound across the deck in search of the man. The searches come up empty. Did anyone see him? Did he cover his ears? And then he sees Nikki, her ears covered snugly by a familiar green bandana. She looks horrified, one hand clasped over her mouth as her face grows pale. Beside her, Tubbo and Ronbu stand side by side, arm in arm, looking as if they've seen a ghost. All three shake their heads. Shit. Technoblade practically throws himself to the port side of the ship, where the rocks are now mere dots on the horizon. And then he hears it, or rather, the sirens have gone silent. Turn this ship around, he barks. All hands on deck. There's a clamor as the crew rises to his command, fueled by the same urgency that burns like fire in his veins. Every second is too long. Every moment another moment that Phil could be hurt, could be drowning, could be dying. No matter how the wind favors them, it still takes too long to get them close, but not close enough to see anything at all. They're still a few dozen meters out, and Technoblade can feel nothing but the all-encompassing panic as he strains to catch any glimpse of motion amidst the rocks and waters. Get us closer, damn it! We can't! Nikki cries, and she looks stricken. The waters are too shallow. We'll sink her on the rocks if we aren't careful. Then I'll go. Technoblade moves swiftly to the side of the ship, where the lone dinghy sits ready to use. A few crew members are quick to help him, and he clambers in as they begin to lower it toward the water. Tommy and Nikki move as if to join him, but he waves them off with a grimace. Can't risk it, he says firmly. I'll go by myself. If I don't make it back, you're in charge, Nikki. Nikki nods solemnly. Tommy looks indignant, but thankfully doesn't protest, seeming to recognize the urgency of the situation. Technoblade's stomach drops along with the dinghy, and then the ropes are tossed, and he's paddling harder than he's ever paddled in his life. It seems to stretch on for hours, though it's likely only minutes. His whole body is alight with adrenaline, his blood roaring in his ears, and his heart fluttering frantically in his chest. He's not sure he'd hear the sirens now, even if they were still singing. The only thought on his mind is of Phil. Foolish, idiotic, self-sacrificial Phil, who probably spent more time worrying about the crew than himself. Don't be dead, he hisses from between gritted teeth as he rows. If you're dead, I'll kill you. As he rows closer, his breath rasping out in ragged pants, his arms burning as he single-handedly rows faster than a half-dozen men would, he catches hints of a murmured conversation flitting across the ocean's surface from behind the rocks. So there I was. A dozen men. Just one shot left. So then And then... Phil. He's still alive, thank the gods. But he won't be for long when Technoblade gets his hands on the bastard. He's still a few feet away from the rocks when he stands, leaping from the boat and barely leaping the distance. His hands burn from where they catch on rough stone, but he barely bats an eye, clawing his way upward until he's able to catch a glimpse of the scene in the tide pools below. Phil is alive, and he's smiling. The pirate sits, sprawled casually, in the lap of a siren with long, dark, flowing hair and tanned skin. She'd be considered beautiful, were Technoblade to have eyes for such a thing, but beautiful like the sea is beautiful, powerful and dangerous and untamed. She cradles him like a babe as he gestures wildly, midway through some eccentric story. Phil is grinning goofily, his gaze fixed on her every movement, his voice soft and breathy despite the excitement of his tale. Tell me, my lady, would you like to hear the tale of the day I fought the dread Captain Squidkid? She nods, and giggles along as if entranced, her gaze equally fixed on his as her tale, black as the night sky and gilded with gold like 1,000 shimmering stars, lazily flicks water up from the tides below them. And then she lifts a hand toward his face. Technoblade opens his mouth to shout a warning, but his words die on his lips when her hand moves to tip his chin up. Phil's words die too, his story petering off into a soft gasp as he looks up at her. There's a brief moment of silence, and then the siren dissolves into light laughter, shaking her head. Is that all it takes to shut you up? Her voice is light, teasing almost, and Phil hums, sitting up a little and taking one of her hands in his own. Can I tell you a secret? Go on. I always thought the sea was my one true love, Phil says, with a sappy grin on his face. But her beauty pales next to you, my lady. There's a faint tinge on the siren's cheeks as she stares down at the man cradled across her lap, one of her fingers twirling playfully around a loose, sodden strand of his hair. Phil flutters his eyelashes up at her, his own cheeks a bright pink, his grin so wide it must hurt. She moves closer, as if to kiss his forehead, and that's when Technoblade makes his appearance known, vaulting over the stone to land a few feet away from them. Get away from him, Technoblade snarls, leveling his pistol at her with his teeth bared. Techno! Phil sounds scandalized. The siren merely chuckles. Relax. I'm not going to eat him. Really? 'Cause I kinda thought that's what sirens like to do. He cocks the weapon, his heart hammering in his chest at the sight of his first mate in the clutches of certain death. Phil, move. Quick. Why would I run from love, mate? Phil looks a little dazed, but he fixes Technoblade with the most incredulous look he can muster. Phil, that's not love, that's magic. Oh no, dear. The siren laughs, bright and melodious like a bell. I haven't sung to him since he first went for a swim. This is all him. Phil giggles. Technoblade just stares. You're kidding me. Well, she is very pretty. Phil has the decency to look sheepish at least. The siren croons at that, holding him closer while Technoblade continues to glower. He slowly lowers his weapon, though he keeps a wary eye on the woman, ready to strike should she show any signs of aggression. I'll admit, this is the first time I've gotten this reaction, the siren murmurs, blinking fondly down at her hopeful pirate suitor, while Technoblade watches on, aghast. Usually they just scream once they get close enough to see my teeth. They're beautiful, Phil assures her immediately, and the pink deepens across her cheeks. Technoblade very nearly gags. I wouldn't change a thing. Oh, aren't you just the sweetest? And so handsome, too. She coos and pinches his cheek. Phil grins roguishly beneath his blushing, and cuts a smug look toward Technoblade. Gross. Oh my gods. Technoblade pinches the bridge of his nose. You've got to be kidding me. Phil, you just jumped off the ship and scared the crew half to death, and I find you sitting here, flirting with a mermaid? Siren, dear, the woman murmurs. And please, call me Kristen. I'm gonna marry her, Phil proclaims later, in a dizzy stupor as they both stumble back onto the deck of the Argo. Phil, you just met her. Phil has a wife? No, Tommy, not yet. Stars above.